Morning, everyone. Hope you're well. We'll wait a second before we get started. Excellent. I like to see the numbers going from 1 to start to build up, and then I realise that it's going out fine and people can see me. That's always a good way to start. So welcome to this week's Learn With Lorna. My name is Lorna Steele and I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. Some of you I'm sure will have watched before and some of you may not, so a very brief overview. The Highland Archive Service has 4 offices across the Highlands. Hark, the Highland Archive Centre in Inverness, the Nucleus, the Nuclear and Caithness Archives in Wick, Loch Archive Centre in Fort William, and Skye and Loch Archive Centre in Portree. This series of Learn With Lorna talks is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these events. But as I always say, if you're in a position to donate towards our work, then please do so. We are so truly grateful for every one of you who have been able to donate. So we really very much appreciate it. So today's talk is the last in the first year of talks, which is extraordinary to think that we've now done, this is the 52nd episode of this series. Oh, thanks, Anne. It's a high of your week. Thank you. I find that too. I really enjoy doing them. So yeah, this is the last in the first year of talks and the last in this March's series on stories and illustrations. It's extraordinary to think, how the world has changed since we started doing these a year ago. These talks started for school groups. We started, obviously, went to work from home and had to think, what can I do from home that I can still be reaching people and still be sharing our collections with people. So it started as a schools project. It has continued to be that, and it appears in school pupils have access to the talks, but it's also branched out much beyond that. And so we now have, over the last year, we've had over 160,000 views of these films, and people following from across the Highlands, across the UK, Europe, and right across the world. I think, unless anyone can correct me and say that in Antarctica, I think that's the only continent that we don't have people watching in. So I wanted to start, before I go into this week's subject, really to just say a huge thank you to you all for sticking with it, for joining, if you've joined somewhere along the way, for your company, for your comments, for your support, for your donations. It's all so much appreciated, and by me and by the wider service. So thank you so much for that. And I also wanted, before I go any further, to take this moment to thank all the staff of the Highland Archive Service, because obviously I kind of put these talks together myself, and I know a fair amount about the collections across all the offices, particularly in Hark, where I'm based. But I have had so much help from my colleagues across the other offices with their much more detailed knowledge of the collections that they deal with day in, day out. So the images that they've sent me, sometimes at short notice, when I've said I need something to illustrate my point. This is the point I need illustrated, and then someone's rallied and found an example for me. Their knowledge and research into their own collections, and a lot of the time as well for sharing how to pronounce things correctly. Highlands is a vast area, and I don't know it all intimately, so this knowledge from the other members of staff is so much appreciated, and I just wanted you all to know that as well, that there's a team behind it, and an awesome team at that. So I hope some of them are able to watch and to see that. So next week we'll be going into the next year of talks. I'm seeing some people saying that you hope that they'll carry on. I see, at the moment, I see no reason for them to not carry on. So as long as you will have me, I will probably be here. So next year, as I say, next week, starting into the second year of talks, I've mentioned before that I'll be putting out a survey, hopefully next week, possibly the week after, but just about how you've engaged with the talks, which ones you've enjoyed, if they've made a difference to you. And so if you can fill those out and take part in them, then I would really very much appreciate that. and I'll let you know more when that is released. Also, particularly, well, for all of you, but particularly Jenny, you had sent me an email asking for this reminder. So our clocks go forward this weekend. So for anyone not watching in Britain, you might have a different time next week. Okay, so we're moving on to this week's subject. This week we're delving into archive collections, maps, ordnance survey name books, things like that, but also branching out into local knowledge and stories to talk a little bit about superstitions, myths, legends, folklore. It's a subject, or these are subjects that are often not answered by our collections. So often things become myth or legend or a vague story that no one can remember the origin of. Those stories often don't have a clear-cut answer within an archive collection, but what they often do have is that the stories have been recorded and then those records kept within an archive collection, and that's what we have here. And also, of course, a huge part of this is oral tradition, that these are stories, legends, myths, beliefs that are passed down through a community, and sometimes they find their way either into our archive collections or into our reference library sections. Okay, so there's loads and loads to cover, so I'm going to do my best. I've broken it into some themes, but as I always say, you'll know that I will not cover everything. So if you've got a particular myth, legend, superstition, please do share it in the chat. Particularly if you've got superstitions that you practice or sort of do subconsciously, please share them, because there may be some that we're not aware of. Okay, so I wanted to start by looking at some of the legendary creatures that we have in the Highlands. Of course, one of our most famous residents is the Loch Ness Monster, so I would be remiss maybe to not mention it. So I'm going to start with the Loch Ness Monster, although actually there are many lochs and watercourses and bodies of water that are reputed to have monsters or creatures within them. There's an example, lots of place names that reflect this. So, for instance, up near Grunard Bay, there is a loch called the Loch of the Beast, and that's got a great story associated with it. Where in the 1800s, a local person tried with pumps that were horse operated to try and drain the loch and find the creature, but they spent years on it and managed to lower the water by 6 inches. So you can imagine that's why they've never drained Loch Ness. Okay, so I have mentioned this book by Gareth Williams several times during the course of this series. I would really recommend it if you're interested in the story of Nessie. It's actually, aside from the kind of publicity and drama that Nessie provokes, it's a really interesting story into scientific research and that kind of hype of publicity. So I would really recommend it. It's also really funny. But he wrote that book based on archive collections held by the University Library in Cambridge, held by us, by the Highland Archive Service, from people's personal research notes through to police files. And in this book, he records that by the mid-1970s, there had already been about 10,000 registered sightings of the Loch Ness Monster. Somebody went through them, broke them down to see, get rid of the ones that are clearly not true, and have a look to see which ones are remotely plausible. And he found that there were 3,000, or the person who had done the research, which Gareth Williams refers to, thought there were about 3,000 of these which were plausible sightings, including that of St. Columba in AD 565. Columba, of course, famous for spreading Christianity across the country. And on travelling to Inverness to meet King Brood, one of Columba's followers jumped into the water to try and access a boat, try and reach a boat. And it was recorded in a contemporary account, so I think, within 50 years or so, that a monster was lurking in the depths of the water, and that it roared with its gaping mouth, and then it sped towards the man who had gone into the water. And it was only thanks to Columba doing the sign of the cross and commanding the creature to retreat that the man's life was saved. Many, as you might expect, converted to Christianity on the spot, and then King Brood himself converted to Christianity shortly afterwards. Sightings continued throughout the centuries. So in the 1570s, there's references in the 1730s when the road was getting constructed. General Wade's Road between the forts was getting constructed along the side of Loch Ness. There was reports of sightings. And then it really kind of took off again, particularly in the 1930s. For some reason, many sightings in and out of the water around about Loch Ness. References to a prehistoric animal, to what became known as a plesiosaur, a whale, a serpent, all sorts of things. And I wanted to read from 1933, which was one of the sightings that really started off the modern phenomena of the Loch Ness Monster. So 1933, if you think in the context of global history, is Germany is rearming, so we're just in the run-up to the Second World War. And Gareth Williams writes, by the end of April, the year that had begun so badly was getting worse. The fishing on Loch Ness was lamentably poor. Further afield, there were now clear signs that Germany intended to rearm. Then, on the 2nd of May, a piece appeared in the Inverness Courier, tucked away on page 5. Even though it was shorter than part 2 of Bird Life in Inverness, it would be the one that would make history. From A Correspondent, it carried the cryptic title Strange Spectacle in Loch Ness. And the report began dramatically. Loch Ness has for generations been credited with being the home of a fearsome-looking monster. This was a real beast, not a water kelpie. It had been seen by a couple driving along the western shore near a Briachan pier on the afternoon of Friday the 28th of April. Like the correspondent, both witnesses were anonymous, but their credentials were solid. He was a well-known local businessman and his wife a university graduate. She spotted it first. A tremendous upheaval about 3/4 of a mile offshore, shattering the mill pond-like calm of the loch. Her husband stopped the car and they watched the spectacle unfold. The creature disported itself, rolling and plunging for fully a minute, its body resembling that of a whale, and the water cascading and churning like a simmering cauldron. Soon it disappeared into a boiling mass of foam. It was many feet long, and its final plunge sent out waves that were big enough to have been caused by a passing steamer. The couple stayed for another half an hour, but the beast did not appear. Both confessed that there was something uncanny about what they had seen and that this was no ordinary denizen of the depths. And so that one sighting was replicated not that long later. A few people saw them round about that time. And then we start to see this huge kind of prolific spread of newspaper reports. It starts to appear in books, start to see photographs start to appear, some that are proved to be fake, some that are not. The Scotsman pulled their special correspondent away from a Royal Navy minesweeper assignment and moved them instead onto Loch Ness Monster, which, as I say, in the context of an arms race in the run-up to a world war, that's quite interesting. The Loch Ness Monster was debated in Parliament. MPs had called that there needed to be a bill of protection to protect the monster because the police and locals, in a police record that was closed until about 10 years ago, recorded that they had to stand round access points onto Loch Ness to stop hunting parties going on with harpoons to kill the monster. And then throughout the 20th century, the kind of technology came into play. So there was use of sonar, there was use of scanning and sounders to try and see if there was a monster in the loch. But at 227 metres or 745 feet deep, you can imagine the scale of that task. Investigation bureaus were set up, scientific research groups were set up. There were scientists sacked from the Natural History Museum in London because they refused to renounce their belief in the creature. That's where I'm going to stop on the Loch Ness Monster, because I know people who firmly believe both sides of the argument. So that's the good thing about myths and legends, that it can't be proved, it can't be disproved. So I'll leave that with you. Feel free to put your opinions into the comments, but certainly I know some locals who fervently either believe that Nessie still exists or that she did at one point. Okay, so that's Nessie out the way in the nicest possible way. What other creatures have we got? We've got kelpies, who are seahorses. We've got selkies, who are creatures who can transform between humans and seals. And I'm seeing Keith Ness comments come up there about Keith Ness with the seals. A good example of a Selkie story comes from Caithness. It comes from the parish of Ulrig, which is in the north of mainland Britain, in the county of Caithness. And it's a local legend that states that there was a baby girl found by a fisherman, and the baby was taken in by the fisherman and his wife, but was later banished from the church because she claimed that she'd seen the devil lurking in the rafters of the church. After she grew up, the child, who was obviously no longer a child, when she grew up, she died in childbirth, giving birth to her first child, and was buried at St Trotham's Church. And there's a small gravestone in the churchyard, and it's said to have a small hollow within it that never dries out, no matter how hot the day is, how warm the weather is. The hollow in the Selkie baby's grave never dries out, perhaps a remaining connection to the sea. And it's interesting, and certainly those of you who are, if there's anyone watching in New Zealand, and I can see there's people watching in Australia, will know, and many other cultures, that connection to water and to the sea and to offerings connected with the sea is really important across many cultures. We've got lots of stories about giants and fairies across the Highlands. I am sure some of you will have heard of the mythological giant in both ways of Celtic legend, Finn McCool. And I know sometimes we have people watching in Ireland, so I'm not sure if you're there today, but if you are, then you'll certainly know all about Finn McCool. There are hundreds of places and landmarks and geological features, geographical features named after Finn McCool and his dog. There are connections to loads of places across Scotland and across Ireland, across Northern Ireland. For instance, the Giant's Causeway in County Antrim is associated with Finn McCool, as is Fingal's Cave in Staffa, Fingal's Seat in Portree. There's places in Arran. There's all sorts of connections to Finn. And all of these things can be seen on maps. So if we go to look at a map, you'll find place names that have these references to giants or to other mythical creatures. And I'll come on to place names in a second, but there's all sorts of references that can be found, such as the story that my colleague Catherine in Skye told me about. I'm going to say Cragan Abachum. If I have pronounced that completely wrong, I sincerely apologise to all Gaelic speakers. Translates roughly as the Rock of the Mouthful. And this is a white section of rock at Skirnish Point in the Isle of Skye. And this is named after a story of a giant who was not able to get to his normal hunting grounds, couldn't get the food he would normally eat, and so gorged himself on shellfish, and had so much shellfish that he was violently sick right across Loch Snizort, leaving a white patch on the cliff on the other side, which then became known as the Rock of the Mouthful. So these stories are to be found right throughout our landscape. Another giant who appears in the records, or appears in the kind of mythology of the Highlands, is the giant from Caithness who went across to Orkney to try and get better soil. So he looked at his garden, and I know we've got people in Thurso and Wick watching, so you can let me know if this is still a problem. He looked across his garden and thought, the soil quality is terrible, but over in Orkney, it seems to be very green. They seem to have much better quality of soil, so I'm going to walk across the Pentland Firth and scoop up 2 handfuls of soil and put them in my casey, which is a basket worn on the back, and take it back to Caithness. And so he scooped up these 2 handfuls and created what became known as the Harry Loch and Stenness Loch. But on his way back, walking through the Pentland Firth, which we've discussed so many times is very stormy, these lumps of turf fell out and created the Isle of Grahamsay and the hills of Hoy. The giant gave up and went home to tend his garden in peace and didn't venture across the Pentland Firth again. Stories of fairies abound, and I'm seeing Fiona mentioning Fairy Hill. So there are so many places in Scotland and of course in the wider world as well that refer to fairies in their titles. And it's interesting, again, similar to the Loch Ness Monster, that when people have these encounters, quite often they find their way into newspaper reports at the time, maps, reference books. There's stories live through being retold. A good example of this is Tomnahurich Hill, which if any of you are familiar with Inverness at all, you will know it's, again, the Fairy Hill. A very distinct shape, the hills in Inverness. And it is now a large and very beautiful cemetery. But it has several stories connected to the fairies. And one is that two fiddlers who were in Inverness were approached to play at a party. And so they took up the offer and they followed the person and they went in through a hole in the side of Tomnahurich Hill. And they played at this party. The fairy queen was there and all these beautifully dressed party goers enchanted. And these two fiddlers played to the fairy queen and the crowd of fairies. They played their fiddles and they danced until morning. And then in the morning when they left the hill, hundreds of years had passed and nobody recognised them anymore. They didn't recognise the places had changed so much. And another person who had an encounter with fairies was Caithness poet and blacksmith. I'm going to say George Levac. Now, it's either Levac or Levac, so please do correct me if I've got that wrong. But he met the fairy queen and her attendants when he was out walking along the River Wick. And this is in 1895. So really comparatively recent compared to some of the things we've touched on. But his report of that encounter with the fairies so much impressed the people of Wick that they threw a big hotel reception and dinner in his honour. They gave him a silver-topped cane, which had an inscription on it that said that it had been presented to him by his admirers for his bravery displayed among the fairies. And that is to be found in Wick Heritage Museum, the original cane. And he went on to have other encounters with the fairies which were recorded in the John O'Groat Journal, and one of them was in a place called Fairy Hillock, which comes back to what we've been talking about, and I'm seeing the comments coming up about place names that link into this. So I'll come back to place names in just a second. A reminder before I go any further that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, and that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part in these. But as I've said so many times, if you're able to donate, please do, and thank you so much to those of you who have. Okay, so place names, OS name books, maps, all of these archive sources, statistical accounts is another one. All of these archive sources tell you a lot about how these myths and legends and stories have wound their way into the fabric of a place. So Fairy Glen, and I'm seeing other Fairy Dell, Fairy Hillock, Fairy Hills coming up. Fairy Bridge. There's the Glen of the Giant's Labour in Caithness, which is believed to have been formed by 3 cuts of a giant's spade, and it's a common site of a place for ghost sightings. There's the Well of the Phantom Hand by the side of Loch Ness near Dors, which is believed that when people went to get a drink from the well, a phantom or outstretched hand would appear over their head, which I have to say I don't like that. Don't like the thought of that. The Swelkie is a great one. Now this is a tidal race and whirlpool off the north end of the island of Stroma in Caithness. And this is, the word comes from the Old Norse, Svalga, which means the swallower, which I love. I love that. I did languages, English language at university, and I just did a lot of Old Norse, and I love the way those words have translated into our language and conveyed something beyond their original meaning, so that a whirlpool would be called the swallower from Svalga is excellent. And it was believed that 2 enchantresses were travelling on a Viking longboat across the Pentland Firth, and that they were making salt, and they called on the god Loki to help them make salt, grind the salt, but they ground far too much salt and the boat sank. And Loki was so annoyed with them for letting it get to that stage that he condemned them to be destined to sit at the bottom of the Pentland Firth grinding their mills still. So the story that perhaps that place name comes from that. There's the Field of the Dragon in Skye. I'm saying Skye, it might be Loch Alsh. Field of the Dragon on the west coast. The Field of the Big Men, and I wanted to read to you a little extract about that from the first statistical account from the 1700s. that explains how the field of the big men came to be known as that. So this is written, it's 1700s, and it says, "The tradition accounting for the erection of the dunes is sufficiently wild. According to this, they were built by two giants of stature and strength so immense that one placing himself at a convenient distance from the mountain from which the materials were quarried, and the site on which the dunes are reared, handed the stones to his companion, who without further trouble constructed the fabrics in all the magnitude which it is said they once appeared. As evidence and illustration of the powers of this titanic race, a huge rock of at least 50 tons is shown as a missile which the one brother hurled at the other, on occasion when detected by him in the act of carrying off from his castle the fire which he had left on the hearth on going forth to the chase. The straits of Kahuluin and Kahuluin, separating Skye at 2 points from the mainland, are said to bear their names because of the usual mode of passage was to leap over them." And it goes on to talk about the story of the field of the big men being where they're buried, and that there was a curse put on the site, and that nobody was allowed to dig in the land. But then that several years later, people had kind of plucked up the courage to go and dig this piece of land and see what they could find. But the curse came upon them, and they were deluged in rain and had to stop digging. But before they stopped, it says in the statistical account, they had, however, in their search come upon 2 sarcophagi formed of large flagstones and containing the remains of human skeletons embedded in the finest sand of most extraordinary size. The bones, on being exposed to the air, crumbled into dust. But an idea of their dimensions is well given by an eyewitness, who states that when the under jawbone of one of the skeletons was applied around the lower part of a very large man who was present, it could be so held without touching him, being nearly 12 inches apart. And it goes on to say that for a long time, the kind of the association of this being a sacred place associated with the giants prevented it from being built on, but that only lasted for so long, and now it has been ploughed, and that very few people now know where those hillocks are. And that was, as I say, written in the 1700s. There's lots of battles that play places that play into myths and legends. So things that might start as a fact and then go on to build into legend. And I am seeing that it is nearly 1:30, so I will try and go a little bit faster. But so, for instance, in 1870-71, when it was all happening in the world, there were sightings of a ghostly battle near Loch, Loch Untitled Chapter, which is just up on the hill above Inverness, to the south of Inverness. Witnesses of the battle saw troops in formation, they saw cavalry, they saw wounded soldiers tending to their injuries. And again, there were lots of newspaper reports about this sighting. And they didn't know if it was echoes of a former battle or if it was some kind of reflection of the Franco-Prussian War that was currently happening in France. Is that what they had somehow absorbed? And there's a collection in Skye which contains a lot of folklore material, which is the Donald Gillis collection. And that contains the story of how the Field of Blood near Loch came to be known as such. And it describes the story of a battle in 1527-28 between the MacDonalds and the MacLeods. And that several of those who had tried to cross the Scabost River following the battle had been decapitated, and that their heads had floated downstream into a small yare down by the side of the loch, which became known as the Yare of the Heads. So you had the Yare of the Heads and the Field of Blood. And again, there are still 2 mounds of earth said to be nearby there, which were the burial places of the clans who had taken part. And you can see how a factual battle, over time, bits of it become exaggerated or retold or mistold, and things turn from fact into legend, and it becomes much harder to tell which is which. I'm not going to go into the subject of witches and the devil here, because I think it merits a separate post. I think it's a big enough subject to carry as its subject on its own, so I will maybe be putting that in. And I didn't want to try and rush through it and not do it justice. So I wanted to just mention 2 final men before I go on and just fly through some of the traditions that we maybe are still affected by. The first is Kahuluin, a demigod of Irish mythology. And again, if you are still there, Red, you'll know some of the story of this. I am quite sure. He was believed to be beautiful and powerful. He was, as I say, a demigod. So his father was a god and his mother was a mortal. He killed Culan's hound, but out of because it had he had killed it, but not in a kind of malicious way. That sounds silly, but out of respect to the owner of the hound, he had said that he would do the herding of the cattle in the dog's place because he had been the reason that the dog had been killed. And that's how he came by his name. But he then was sent over to train in the art of war under Scaith, who was a woman, a female warrior, and a trainer of warriors. And so he spent time in Skye training. And Donald Gillis' collection contains lots of stories of Kahuluin's training and his escapades in Skye, including his learned ability to go into a kind of battle frenzy when he was in a fight, much like the berserkers of Viking legend, who could almost make themselves mad and terrifying in a battle concept. And Kahuluin went back, left Skye, leaving a pregnant woman behind, went back, got married, and several years later the child went to find him, but the child was, Kahuluin mistook the child for an intruder and killed him. There are so many stories associated with him that I could go into, but really the connection to Skye in some respects is quite brief. But it's that lasting legacy of a person who becomes associated with a place and how that persists in the imagination, and again in place names and in statues and things like that. But I say place names, but I'm reliably informed by my colleagues in Skye that Kahuluin is not the reason for the Cuillin mountain range being so named. Apparently that is named after upturned boats. So I just thought I would share that. And yes, I know I'm seeing lots of people saying I could carry on for an hour on this subject. I could easily, but maybe we'll do another one. But the other man I wanted to talk about briefly was Kenneth Mckenzie, the Bran Seer. And this will give you a laugh. I'm sure that last night when I was writing my notes, I was quite weary, and I looked down to see that instead of writing Kenneth Mckenzie, the Bran Seer, I had written Kenneth Branagh, a British actor who I'm sure is not connected to prophecies and burnings, but he was apparently a native of Lewis and a worker on the Bran estate, which is the stronghold of the Seaforth Mckenzies. Now, I'm saying apparently because there are so many stories about the Bran Seers, prophecies about what he thought would happen in the Highlands, what he thought would happen in the world. But there's also so many people who don't believe that he ever existed at all, or who believe that the person in Lewis and the person on the Bran estate are two separate people who have somehow become merged and amalgamated over time. So, as I say, it becomes harder and harder to tell what's fact and what's not when it's not written down in contemporary sources. And so, yes, he was famous there were stories from the 1500s, from the 1600s, of him having second sight and making these prophecies about the future of the Highlands and the future of all sorts of things. So what were some of these prophecies? And as I say, I'm not going to commit to whether he was real or not, or which place he was most associated with, but the concept of the Bran Seer. What were some of the prophecies that he made? Well, they're quite extraordinary. So he predicted that when there were 5 bridges over the River Ness, when it came to pass there were 5 bridges, there would be worldwide chaos. Now, the 5th bridge over the River Ness was completed in August 1939, days before World War II was declared. He said that after there were 9 bridges on the River Ness, shortly after that, there would be a disaster which would have fire and flood and calamity. And the 9th bridge was finished in 1987, and then the Piper Alpha disaster happened in 1988, which was an oil platform in the North Sea, for those of you who don't know, which exploded, killing 167 people in a blaze of flame and obviously water associated with that as well. He predicted that there would be ships one day would appear and sail round the back of Tomnahurich Hill. Now, at the time, that was completely inconceivable because it was away from the course of the river. But a couple of hundred years later, the course of the Caledonian Canal was routed through there. So within 200 or 300 years of that prediction, there were boats sailing around the back of Tomnahurich Hill, which would have been completely unimaginable at the time he wrote it. He predicted that the end of that this particular line of Seaforth Mckenzies would come to an abrupt end, and that happened several hundred years later, when the last of the family died, leaving no heir, and the direct line died out. And there are many others of these stories, and it's interesting. If you kind of type into a search engine some of these things, you'll find that still, when there are planning decisions being made, there are moments where they go, well, there was a prediction that the Seer made about this bit of land, so maybe should we do this? Or interesting how these things perpetuate. He ended up, if he was real, he ended up being boiled in oil at Shannonry Point, just near Fortrose, after one particular prediction where the lady Mckenzie of Seaforth asked for an update on her husband, who was currently in Paris, and she said, how is my husband, what's he doing? And the Brandseer said, he's having an affair with a lady more beautiful than you. And so she had him burned in a barrel of tar. And there is a plaque to this at Shannonry Point. So I'm going to round off, and I am aware that I'll be about 10 minutes over, but I want to round off by just mentioning some of the ways that everyday superstitions can come into our lives. And I did a talk on the Hetty Munro collection a while ago. I did a talk on the Margaret MacDougall collection a while ago. And both of those have great examples of superstitions that they have gathered and recorded, asking people what they do and recording that so that it appears in our archive collections. So I'm going to reel off some of them, but please do continue to share them. I'm seeing some of them coming in at the sides. I keep doing this because I can see them down the left-hand side of my screen. So please do continue to do that. But Rowan trees is a common one. Rowan trees often planted around a house or worn in a sprig to protect from witches. Hetty Munro recorded one that if you made a glass ring, if you knocked a glass and it made that high-pitched ringing noise that glass makes, you have to stop it very quickly before it has a chance to die out naturally, because if that sound dies out naturally, then somewhere a sailor has drowned. The belief that if you wash your face in dew on the 1st of May, it will keep you young and beautiful throughout the next year. The story that broom will only grow well if lovers have pledged their troth on the site that the broom grows, and if they then break that agreement to each other, the broom will die. I'm not sure what that means for the broom I have pulled up in my garden last week, but the wearing of silver to prevent the evil eye. So the evil eye could be someone could destroy something just by looking at it or admiring it, that it would crumble and destroy in front of them. And so many things that people would do to protect against the evil eye. And there was a story that if someone had been affected by the evil eye, you could cure them by washing them in water which the living and the dead had both passed over. So water from under a bridge. You could wash someone, and that would maybe get rid of the evil eye. And that was something that was strongly believed. And I've mentioned before in previous weeks about the importance of customs at birth, marriage, and death moments. Those big life-changing moments are surrounded by custom and tradition right across the world. So, for instance, one that Margaret MacDougall recorded was that you never leave a baby alone in a room with a cat, because a cat will suck the breath away from a baby. Wakes we held traditionally sitting with the body from before it was buried, because they believed that the spirit hovered above the dead body, and that if you left the body unguarded, the spirit would go into back into the body and create a monster. So you needed to stay with the body and make noise so that the spirit wouldn't have the chance to re-enter the body. Marriage, I maybe mentioned this one before, but marriage customs that if you took a dandelion and blew it, it was how many times it took you to get rid of all the seeds would be how many years you would be waiting to be married. There are just so many things that we do and that we do day in, day out without realising as well. And folklore surrounds us in the Highlands, as it does in so many different parts of the world, in place names and stories, in the collections that we hold in the Highland Archive Service, where people have investigated those oral traditions and tried to record them. And I think some of these things are things we do day in, day out without realising. I have a friend who will fervently not cut down the Rowan tree in her garden in case something happens. I have another friend who, every time she sees a magpie, will say, "Good morning, magpie, how's the wife?" and would not think of not doing it. People touch wood, all those sorts of things that we still do all the time. Anyway, I'm very, very conscious I've run over a bit, so I hope you have enjoyed this whistle-stop tour through some of the myths, legends, stories and superstitions that surround the Highlands. It may be that we come back and do a second one of these, we'll see. But yeah, do share your own stories if you would like to do so. Next week, I'll be looking at the amazing, prolific work of Alexander Ross, an architect who was responsible for the creation of many, many prominent buildings across the Highlands. So I hope you can join me for that. A reminder again that the clocks will change in the UK this weekend, so we'll be potentially at a different time of day for you if you're in a different country. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that there's no payment or subscription required to take part. But if you're able to donate, then we would very much appreciate it. Thank you so much for all your lovely messages. I'm really glad you enjoyed it. It was an interesting one to write. And I'll see you next week for the anniversary one of the year. Thank you.